Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm of the Capitol kind. So if you are curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Carter, and I am your host. And I first want to invite you, if you like the show, to please rate, review, share, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you're using. Today, we are joined by I guess I say a total of three out of the four of us. I'm joined by Reverend Blair and Julia. How are y'all doing?
Good morning.
Good morning. Still here.
We
Just
miss Wesley.
swimming.
But
We do miss Wesley.
We do,
He's
yeah,
really busy.
we do miss Wesley. Yeah, this is a busy time of year for everyone. So that's part of the reason. Y'all are going to be getting this episode, I think, probably January 3rd. And we are recording it in the middle of December. So that means if something crazy's happened and you're listening to this podcast expecting to hear us discuss that crazy thing that happened sometime between January or December 13th and January 3rd, unfortunately, we won't be talking about it. However, if something did happen, I'm sure we would have recorded a mini-sode to discuss it. So, but we want to get a couple episodes recorded because we're all going to be traveling, working. Obviously, this is one of my two busy seasons as a pastor. So I will be doing a lot of things. So we wanted to get a couple episodes recorded ahead of time, but also to discuss some topics that we have been mapping out and thinking about, knowing that we want to discuss anyway. So in this episode, we are going to be talking about the E word, one might say, evangelism, the word that a lot of progressive Christians don't particularly want to use. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that and why that's the case, and kind of make an argument for what does it mean to recapture a love for that, not only that term, but what it means to evangelize from a progressive Christian perspective. The primary reason we are talking about this, I should say not the primary reason, but one of the reasons we're talking about it is because, Blair, this is your dissertation topic. So this is like an area of interest for you specifically, correct?
this is my academic area of expertise. This is what I went to study for a PhD, was evangelism, particularly from a progressive perspective. There aren't many people doing it. So
If by that you mean, I think there's like three, like it's
there's
a handful.
probably a few more than that, but it's hard too, because to get jobs, you have to be very middle of the road. And I've just sort of decided, like, I'm not middle of the road on our need for evangelism or on our need for liberation. So we'll see if I get a job.
And so you simultaneously decided that you may not get a job.
It's true. But this is the work that God has called me to do, so I'm going to do it.
Yeah, it's like, well, I may. Yeah, there's a cost. I think part of the reason you got to, being strategic. Like, I think my degree is in ethics and theology because I was like, well, I need to make sure I can apply for multiple things because that's the stuff that matters. And with the MDiv, like an extra year of school just in case so I can get a job at a church, which ultimately is what I end up doing anyway. So now, before we really get into the depth of the topic, Blair, I know you're writing it from a feminist perspective, and so I thought maybe it'd be helpful for us to at least spend a few minutes talking about two important terms that are going to come up so that people understand what we mean by them right off the bat. Now, like, how do you define feminism? Like, what does feminism mean to you?
Yeah, so I use the second wave feminist, which is American waves of feminism, or first wave feminist theology definition from Rosemary Radford Ruther, which is feminism is the pursuit of the full human flourishing of all women. And then Letty Russell, who is also a second wave feminist, describes it as feminism is the pursuit of flourishing and liberation for women and men and all of creation. So it's this idea that, like, redemption, wholeness, if we start with the experiences of women, that gives us a pathway to then extend liberation and flourishing and abundance to all of creation.
I mean, Julia, does that, like, in terms of how you would think about what that means to you as a woman, as a Black woman of color, like, does that encompass what you think of when you're talking about feminism from your own perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I generally, your second definition is a little closer to what I think of. I have
Mhm.
kind of come to think of myself as more of a womanist. But that's kind of where I land on it. I like the more expansive idea of it.
And when
Yeah.
you say womanist, do you mean beginning with the experience of Black women in particular?
I mean, beginning with the experience of women led by the experiences of the oppressed women
Mhm.
specifically. But
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, like, so the term womanism was created, first defined by Alice Walker, a black woman, and ostensibly there's some distinction between being a black feminist and a womanist. Although there is definitely overlap, or a feminist of color.
Mhm.
Mostly people who identify as womanists tend to be more religious, tend, and that's really probably the primary difference. Other folks might say they're black feminist, and that's just because of the way in which they approach and think about religion.
right.
So Alice Walker, when she's just talking about womanism, she defines it. I think there's one line in there that says, "Womanism is to feminism as purple is to lavender." Right.
Mhm.
So it's this idea that it's just a different shade, if you will, of the same kind of thing, but all coming in the same perspective of perhaps starting from the experience of women of color, but applies to all women and people. Still about
Mhm.
challenging oppression, still centering women's experience. Similarly, like, I have always been drawn to both Walker's definition of womanism and Bell Hook's definition of feminism, is essentially just a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. And so that's from her book, Feminism is for Everybody.
Mhm.
And what I liked about it is because it's clearly not anti-male, right?
Right.
It's really just about addressing the problem of sexism, and everybody needs to be about addressing sexism, whether you're, regardless of your gender or sexual orientation. Sexism is about, structured oppression against people that gendered as women. And so I think for me, both the womanist definition of womanism, definition of feminism, recognizing that they're not anti-male, but they're really at their core anti-oppression, specifically thinking about it from a woman's perspective, just has always resonated with me once I understood what it was. Because I think all too
Mhm.
often, too many men hear feminism and they think, oh, it's anti-male.
It
Right.
makes me think of, do you remember when Beyonce um, performed at the S- Super Bowl and people were like, she's right and she's racist? And someone said, racism in America are so intrinsically linked that you can't criticize one without automatically criticizing the other. And I oftentimes think about that with feminism and patriarchy. Like, you
Mhm.
can't, people are so invested in patriarchy that you cannot criticize it without people feeling as though you are just criticizing men. And I think that that is telling.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, my wife has said, now y'all know my wife loves funny T-shirts with funny different sayings on them, and so we were thinking about different T-shirts to get made. And the one, we were talking about something in the kitchen the other day, and she said, she's like, something should say like, English is America's first language and racism is America's second. And I just thought, ooh, and that was
Ooh.
and that was on a T-shirt. Oh, but then we're talking about,
Yowza.
okay, like, do you say racism is America's second, and then sexism is the third, or like, how do you? Anyway, but it started an interesting conversation around just like the normative nature of these kinds of ways of thinking, and so yeah, to the point. Go ahead, Blair.
I have had so when I tell scholars that this is the framework that I'm using, they like gently try to ask, am I like man hating? I had that happen at a in a conversation at a conference this year, and it's just interesting because from a theological perspective, it's absolutely about liberation for like all people and the end of oppression in every form. But it's the idea that we're starting with a person who has experienced oppression. And so I'm a white woman. So I have not claimed to be a womanist. I read womanists. I love them. I consider them. I am not a mujerista, which is the theological framework for Latina women. Asian American women have created like a post colonial Asian American feminist theology. So I try to be intersectional in my feminism by reading the voices of women's experience across even gender diversity and ethnic and cultural diversity, racial diversity, But I use the term feminist because I am a white woman, and the place that I'm starting from is that intersection of my oppression is from being a woman, but I have privilege from being white. And so I don't try to cross over or claim that intersectional oppression, or that I could understand it. And so I'm like trying to stay in my own lane by being feminist, but I am trying to pursue an intersectional feminism that is considering that my experience of oppression is not the only experience of oppression that women have, that there's a diversity of ways in which that plays out, and to be cognizant of that.
No, I think that totally makes sense. And honestly, one of the parts that you've already written, that you wrote in your dissertation proposal, which you've already been crafting, that I want to make sure we at least get to at some point, is fact of the matter is, like, women constitute the majority of church. Women have constituted the majority of missionaries. And so what does it
Mm-hmm.
mean, right, that we haven't thought about this from this perspective? But before we get that far, I like to just, I guess, start by saying, like, why was this topic important to you? Why was it important to you, and why do you think it's important for progressive Christians to actually think about evangelism?
Yeah. So I went to seminary by accident. I was not planning to become a pastor. I grew up as a United Methodist and was like deeply embedded in like the co-working of pursuit of justice and pursuit of holiness. And my church actually did a pretty good job balancing those two things. And I went to seminary because I met someone who said, "Oh, you want to do international human rights?" I thought I might go to law school. I applied for the White House internship, like, but I met somebody who was like, "Oh, you're interested like in church and religion, and you want to do human rights and nonprofit work. We could teach you how to do that, and we'll pay for it because you're Methodist." I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, I didn't have anything else better to do, so I accidentally went to seminary and was planning to do nonprofit work." And then in the course of being in the space where pastors were being trained, and watching the struggle of just so many churches, especially progressive churches, to like get their message out there to combat the sort of public perception of Christianity in America as being bigoted and exclusive, instead of what I had experienced growing up, which was inclusive, LGBT inclusive, racially diverse, socioeconomically diverse, like loving, justice oriented community. Like I knew that existed, and it was so frustrating that the rest of the world didn't seem to know that existed. And so the place you go to learn about why aren't we better at talking about this is evangelism. And because evangelism has traditionally been seen as like church marketing or church PR in the 50s and 60s, there's a development of like the church growth movement. And so I wanted to understand, like, how do we tell people what it is to be part of a loving faith community, what it is to be liberated by the grace of Christ without offending them. And then as I started being more adamant about this is a thing we need to do, I started to see how deeply uncomfortable it made people in the progressive church. And eventually that's why I ended up going back to do my PhD, because I was in the church, I was church planting, I was doing ministry with new people, I was bringing new people into the church, and it was making church folks so uncomfortable that I was doing that. And really that was the question I wanted to pursue, was like, why are we so uncomfortable with the idea that we have a faith worth sharing? And how could I help progressive, liberation minded, deeply faithful Christians re-embrace this concept that what we do and who we are and the stories that we hold dear are worth telling people about. So that's how I ended up in evangelism.
Yeah, I mean, that's, and honestly, because I was present for part of your story. I mean, for, Blair and I
Mm-hmm.
were ordained or commissioned at the same time, and that's where I began to see you and began to learn about your approach and some of the opportunities for growth and challenges you were having, and your desire to start to pursue a PhD is kind of when I came into relationship with you, and I would agree, like, it is definitely something that evangelism is something that is not easy to talk about in progressive Christian spaces. I know at our church, Julia, like, I don't I think about our growth strategy, if you will, if you want to talk about it from an evangelism perspective, as really centering on our music ministry, like the things that you do. Like literally, I'm like, our music is great. People who come here for worship are going to enjoy what it is we do. That's a big part of what I want to do. I want the preaching to be good. I want people to actually create community within that, when they're there, right? But actually going out into the world necessarily and pulling people and saying, "Oh, you should come," feels strange to me. And I don't know if that
Mhm.
is that the same, Julia? I mean, do you feel that way or not? Because you actually do a great job when people come in. Like you're
Julia's a
very,
great
yeah.
inviter.
I'm like, yeah, and I'm just like, hey, I'm gonna be talking. Y'all gonna hear enough of me anyway. You'll need to really see me. So anyway,
I mean, Blair preached while you were on sabbatical this summer, and this is how, I mean, I met Blair before. It doesn't matter. We all go back. But I was really moved by her work because I sincerely believe that the rise of Christian nationalism is because there's been a vacuum of discussion about Christianity, and like progressive people are so hesitant to talk about their faith. And in that space, the worst kind of Christians have kind of gotten to grab a hold of the moniker and run around now saying the most atrocious things in the name of this faith that I hold very dear and I take very seriously. I don't ever feel ashamed to talk about my faith because I think it's so important, because it is so central to like who, like, I really believe it. Like, I'm a believer.
Mhm.
Like, I genuinely believe in liberation. And the reason that I believe in it is because I was born and bred a Methodist, and like I grew up in the AME church. And so I
Mhm.
talk about it openly. And there are a lot of phrases that I use that people think are weird, but I just think of them like, I love the idea of partnering to someone that with whom you are equally yoked. And people get so ick by that phrase because of what it means in the conservative church, but it means a different thing to me, but I'm still going to use it. And people are going to misunderstand me 100% of the time, but then that just gives me an opportunity to explain myself that they don't really care about, but that's okay.
You're
now
naming a really important point, Julia, about like church ease, right? Because even evangelism, like then we started, I talked about the church growth movement, and then we started talking about church growth. And in reality, evangelism is so much bigger than church growth. Like that
yeah.
is one little sliver piece of what evangelism really is. But I'm big on reclaiming historic Christian cultural words. Sorry, Dr. Carter, you were going to
Oh,
say
no,
something
all I
else.
was gonna say, I mean, it's actually tied into what you're just saying. Like, I think for me, one of the challenges I have is I have no problem talking about my faith. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about being a parent of a 5-year-old and going to playgrounds is you have to talk to. You don't have to. I talk to the parents on the playground, and so what I do for a living inevitably comes up, and I will talk about what I do, and I'll talk about my faith and my beliefs. What I tend to not do though is to invite people to my own community, to the community I lead. And reading your perspectives has made me want to do some more internal examination as to why I don't do
Mm-hmm.
that. Because I'm not fully sure. There's one of my son's friends I have invited who isn't even Christian, but as we were talking, we had a deeper conversation. I was like, I actually think you might like what it is we do,
Mm-hmm.
even though you're not necessarily religious, but that's because what we do at the loft, you that you don't have to be you don't have to be Christian to find that we could be your people necessarily. But there is something, Blair, that I'm curious if you've been able to kind of put what your assumptions might be, or what some of your early thinking might be around why is it that progressives have ceded this space, as Julia mentioned, to conservatives, where we're elected to invite people to our religious spaces, or to even go beyond that, what you mean by evangelism.
Yeah. So there's a split between evangelism and mission or slash witness. And it's a political split. It's not actually a theological. Well, I guess it's how you do your theology. But in the post-colonial era, so beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, when literally colonized countries were gaining their freedom. And the history of Christianity is that mission historically has been connected to Western imperialism and Western colonialism. So as these countries in Africa and across Asia were kind of throwing off imperial control, different places had to figure out what to do with Christianity, because in some spaces Christianity had become deeply embedded and embraced by the people of the land and enculturated, like become authentic to who they are. But in other places, Christianity had just been utilized as a tool for cultural control. And there was a split in the mission movement in the 60s, where one group said, we have to let each independent country and each independent culture decide what they want to do. And missionaries got kicked out of countries. It was a whole movement of like missionary go home. And that it was not our job, in fact, to evangelize the world in one generation, which was this like theme that the global Christian I say global with big air quotes because it was mostly white European Americans who were making this pact, but there were other people involved from the global South as well in Edinburgh in 1910 that had launched sort of this colonial missionary modern movement. But anyway, in the post-colonial era, they split. And the ecumenical group, which we think of as like mainline meaning like Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, Episcopal, groups who work together, they said, we're not going to be so focused on converting people to Christianity. We're going to be focused on supporting the decolonial process, responding to people's human needs, that the mission of the church now is to support that process of decolonization. And if that means we have to hold back the name of Christ, then that is what we do, because the long-term mission is to support God's creation. And then there was a different group that said, no. We have to do spiritual conversion. And this became the Lausanne movement, which is the like cohort of evangelical voices. Some of them come from the mainline traditions, but it's mostly Pentecostal and what we now think in the United States is non-denominational Southern Baptist. The Lausanne movement basically said, like, that's neat that you want to do human development. We also want to do that, but you have to name Christ, and you have to have the point of doing that work is to convert people to Christianity. And it became, Lausanne continued to use evangelism for the language of the work that they were doing, and the ecumenical movement used mission or witness. And so it became that evangelical and evangelism was attached to a particular ideology that was still pushing colonial and imperialist control, ultimately, white colonial and imperialist control. And that folks who were trying to do like anti-racist work, like the very roots of international anti-racist work, were claiming instead mission or witness. And so this word evangelism became so deeply linked with this political ideology that even today, when we try to use it, people have like a trauma response to the very real trauma that has been done using the name evangelism. And so even though the concept of evangelism is bigger than this particular converting the nations mode of operation, the word itself and the concept of imposing one's faith upon someone else, which is not evangelism, that's proselytism. We have actually a different word for it. Proselytism is like the required conversion, which has happened in America or in Christian history, where people were forced to convert or die. That's proselytism. Evangelism is like a broader question about how people participate in salvation. I define evangelism, the academic study, as practical soteriology, or how does salvation occur, basically, and then what is our participation in it. That's what I think evangelism is about, is what is salvation and how is humanity engaged with God in the process of salvation. But that's not what the word means to most people. And so I'll take a pause here because I'm like lecturing now, but I think it's actually like a moral injury. It's a post-traumatic or ongoing trauma response. Even if evangelism has never been used against you individually, we are connected to the global trauma of imperialism and colonialism under the banner of evangelism. And so that response, that like guttural ick disgust of like, oh no, I can't tell people about my faith with the intent that they would come and be part of it. Like that happens to us because the word is tied to a story of domination and trauma. And so we have to actually work to overcome, correct, and I think reclaim the beauty that is evangelism. But that has to start from a trauma-informed place of recognizing that the harm done in the name of evangelism is real and ongoing.
I think, I mean, it was, you could, I mean, you needed a lecture because this is your expertise, and I'm like, I'm learning from you. But what it brought to my mind is being, we're here in Southern California, and if you go to school here, like even Isaiah next year will be learning about the California missions and the ways in which you have these indigenous communities, indigenous people who
Trampled.
yes. I mean, just like, so that, their relationship with the Catholic Church is quite complicated. You know what I'm saying? Like we have many, because, the indigenous and what we would call Mexican, like this is all very blended here, right? And so, well, you have many people of Mexican descent who are Roman Catholic. You have folks who resisted because of the history of the mission movement. And for those of you who don't know, the missions were like these, ostensibly these places where they forced conversion of indigenous and Latinx communities of people, and this is where they had different kinds of schools where they took children from their families. Again, this is particularly relate to indigenous communities, and and you even find places where there's been like mass graves where like many of these children have died from malnutrition or abuse and things of that nature, so much so that the Pope, like from the Roman Catholic perspective, is like doing all this reconciliation work in Canada because it kept going much longer than it stopped in America. So there is a real trauma response when this came up in my systematic theology classes with people from Southern California because of the history of the missions here. And so I think acknowledging that from the beginning, a part of the challenge of using the term is the baggage, and that baggage is real. It's not like made up. Like this is real. I think it's critical, and I do believe, as you said, there is some space to reclaim. Like there has to be space to say, okay, this is what it was. But again, the way you defined it, how do we participate in this in salvation of the world? Like that is, beautiful because it's not. It's about creating, I would argue, the beloved community, right?
Absolutely.
That's what it's about. What does that mean? To actually, not just the wolf shall lay with the lamb, but also like creating spaces of where life is flourishing. And what does that look like?
I think also it can be difficult because not only is there historical trauma, but there is still trauma that is ongoing.
Oh, absolutely.
And like a lot of conservative Christians, being invited to the loft is very different than being invited to and the intention behind, if I'm inviting someone to come to church with me, is very different than, someone who goes to a more conservative church, like inviting a gay friend to church, there are people who are still trying to save souls in a way that I think is abhorrent and terrifying. But I think people also have an instinct to respond to that reality, right? So if you say you should come to church, they're like, wait, there's an assumption that I believe
I don't need your judgment.
Right.
I don't need to be told how to be better.
Right. You don't need to try to save my soul. And it's so crazy because it's so far from my belief structure, but people don't even know that you can believe something different because no one knows about progressive Christianity
because we're quiet.
Evangelize.
And other people, angry proselytes, are loud. And so I'm like, we need to be louder with the message of love. And I'm not saying that every progressive church with a Black Lives Matter banner and a rainbow flag out front is actually a safe place for the people that they proclaim to welcome. That's the truth. Like, I have pastored in churches where I knew it was not safe for me to invite queer friends. And so what I ended up doing was creating alternative communities where the queer young people I was meeting could be in relationship with each other to do evangelism, to pursue salvation, to pursue the common experience of becoming whole with each other and with God. But I knew that the church that I was pastoring at the time was actually not a safe place for them to do that. And so evangelism in that moment was not inviting people to my church, even though I was the pastor. It was helping them to find and create their own spaces where they could be whole and challenged to grow and heal and flourish.
And in
When
some sense, oh, go ahead,
I have a
Julia.
question because the word has been tossed around twice, well, several times now in this conversation. And I'm just curious how each of you defines salvation. Do you mean saving a soul and making sure it goes to heaven? Whatever. What do people think? What do you think? I don't care what other people think. What do you guys think when you say
Ooh,
this?
you go first, Dr. Carter. If you're ready, actually, you may not want to answer that question, but you
No,
can answer as yourself, Christopher Carter, not as the pastor of the loft.
yeah, I think that's probably fair. I think for me, I am a pluralist, and now some of you may be like, well, what does that mean? I don't believe in a Christianity that has this a narrow conception of God. So I would consider myself a Christian mystic along the lines of like a Howard Thurman, who argued that we are all moving towards a kind of oneness that he understood as God, this kind of being as such. And so by that I mean we are all trying to live in alignment with the moral teachings for me as a Christian that I find in the Bible that lead us to a deeper relationship and connectedness to God, what Richard Rohr would describe as like stepping into the flow, like being in relationship in this dynamic relationship of love. And I would say like for me, salvation starts with love and ends, I won't say ends, but love and forgiveness are deeply tied to what I mean by salvation. Like your capacity to forgive others, I think goes a long way to determine what it means to find yourself on a pathway towards salvation, because it allows yourself to see yourself participating in this redemptive process of healing that can only be done in love. And that love starts from this divine source and it flows through us and allows us to see each other in our both brokenness and our fullness, and see ourselves as creating the image of God and also as needing to be held in compassionate care. And so there isn't this like oath you have to say or this all this other stuff you have to do. Like I think it's, if you believe in a God of love, then you ought to believe that God would have found ways to connect with people in their own particular context, in their own particular ways that is beautiful and beneficial to them. It doesn't have to be through this narrow framework of Christianity, because that's one way, right? At one time. But again, there are folks who have never heard of Christianity, people who Jesus wasn't a Christian, right? Like people who lived before Christianity and people who've never experienced it. And I fundamentally believe, again, if you believe in a God of love, God has connected, been in relationship with, and continues to be in relationship with those people, such that for them, salvation is participating in this divine dance of love. And so that's what salvation means to me. That is not what I had to write from ordination papers. So, so I will say that. And to be fair, I think in my ordination papers, I did talk about Thurman because I think, I talked about being a pluralist. I talked about the importance of naming that for me, salvation is a commitment to Jesus Christ and accepting Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and following in that way, in that teaching. But it's not limited to that for me. It's never going to be limited to that, because I'm not going to limit God. And I think that seems to me pretty straightforward. Blair,
Pretty straightforward. Easy
I think it's pretty
peasy.
straightforward.
See, but this is why most people define evangelism as the proclamation of the gospel, right? And there is this understanding that the gospel is this one singular truth about who Jesus is and how you're supposed to relate to him. And and how you're supposed to pray, right? And how you're supposed to behave, that if you really believe in the gospel, that like your life will be, and we've talked about this, right? This idea of like predestination, that if you're truly chosen, if you're truly elect, if you've truly accepted Christ, then it will be evidenced in your life, right? And I, one, don't think there's one version of the gospel, because gospel just means good news. An evangelist is the bearer of good news, evangel. And I think there is not just one good news. God
Right.
does not just have one way of loving the world and reconciling the world to God's self. So for me as a Wesleyan, I am very Wesleyan, and the things I wrote in my ordination papers are very in line with how I think salvation works. Like, and this is a podcast for another day, but like the idea that God made us and God wants us to be with God, and God is love. So I'm very in line with you there. So if we are with God, that means we are living in the fullness of love, which means there's no pain, there's no suffering, well, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe there is pain and suffering in
Well,
love.
we've
But that's
talked
another
about
conversation.
what is it? What did we talk about it as? Manufactured suffering, as opposed to like just
Right.
being human. The
Being
grief,
human.
right? But there's a difference. But as you were
Right. But anyway, but this is why I think we need to reframe the definition of evangelism. Instead of it being this like single proclamation of this particular cultural explanation of salvation and of the Christian message, instead, if we think of it as practical salvation, that's inviting people to figure out for themselves what salvation means. What is it that you need to be saved from? What is it that you want eliminated in your life? And so, from a feminist perspective, that's patriarchal oppression. And then extending also, like, we want freedom from sexism and racism and degradation of creation. And, right, like, it extends. But it's instead, what if evangelism was asking people, what harms you? And the process of salvation begins with pursuing the freedom from what harms you. And then from the absence of harm, I think salvation then moves towards the pursuit of flourishing, or as a scriptural word would be shalom, like God's full and total peace, reign of peace and justice. And so that's why I think I don't name what salvation is necessarily in my work, because I think part of doing evangelism in a trauma-informed way, in an intersectional way, in a culturally responsive way, is that I may, as an evangelist, come into a community and say, there is Christ offers us a path of healing and flourishing, but you're the one who knows what that looks like. I don't know what that looks like for you, but I'm here to find it with you. And that is a very different posture than the posture of missionaries for most of history, which is, I have the answers and I'm here to impose them upon you.
Well, and isn't it for a lot of people salvation so that you don't burn in hell for all eternity, right?
Yeah, I would say, Blair, I'm curious as to what, I'll make this brief because, Blair, I'm curious as to what you want to say on this. That is the transactional nature of salvation that I think has been used historically to push a kind of that conservative view of evangelism, Blair, you talked about earlier, right? This idea of we need to use this to convert people because it's about avoiding hell. Ultimately, Jesus wasn't talking about avoiding hell.
He was
And I think
Jewish. They don't have hell.
well, I mean, yes, fair.
They have
Good.
Gehenna, which is like a place of suffering.
Yeah, a place where there isn't God, essentially.
But is that after death? Is it?
Yeah.
It's unclear.
Well, I thought it was. Yeah. Let's see. Now we're getting
There's
into
debates.
the
There's debates within Judaism.
But regardless, the point is that I think you're making, Julia, is that for many people, salvation is about the avoidance of suffering rather than about how we ought to live, right? And this is, again, I believe, again, if you're going to call yourself a Christian, this means you should be living in alignment with the teachings of Christ. And the earliest writings we have of the teachings of Christ are found in Mark, where Jesus begins by saying, the kingdom of God is at hand. That means it's about now.
It's right
It's about
here
it's
where
about
we are.
now, like right now. The revolution will not be televised. Like it's
Mhm.
happening now. And
Not
so
after.
yeah,
Not
so I mean
after.
it's pretty straightforward and but at the same but I know the history of how people got to that, this notion of avoiding the wrath to come, which is the language I heard growing up. Because for a lot of people growing up in medieval European history, life was not great.
Rough.
Like,
There
it
was
was
no vision, right? There was no vision of a redemption from suffering in this life.
yeah.
For
And
so many
so
people, things were just too hard, and you had to have a future promise to get you through.
and
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 I
I
do
think
not besmirch anyone who holds that
and I think that
perspective.
what's and this is what's interesting in terms of like the fact of the matter is this way of thinking about salvation emerges in Europe and it doesn't emerge in like Asia or in continental Africa because this is
Right.
their high period. Like this is when
Mhm.
like you go to like China and Japan, like they are in their golden era
They're
of
thriving.
thriving.
They're
Just
having a great time.
and
They don't
so
wanna think about death.
yeah, so
They're enjoying the now.
yeah, and so it's just it's interesting as to how these things develop in these particular times. So yeah.
So I do think it is really important to recognize that evangelism and the concept of salvation begins with questions about the end. And so this is something my advisor, Brian Stone, in Evangelism After Christendom, opens up for the field of evangelism, which is the telos. Like, what is your goal in evangelism? And so that is in alignment with my perspective of practical salvation. What is the goal of salvation? Is it to avoid hell? Is it to avoid suffering? Is it to eliminate suffering? And is it, where are we going? And when you know where you're going, like what is the point? What is the purpose? What is the motivation? It's going to change the way you practice that thing. So if your goal is to keep people from going to hell in the afterlife, you will convert people under any means necessary because you genuinely believe the greatest thing to avoid, the purpose, the end, the telos, is to avoid hell. So who cares what hell they experience now if it means they get eternal flourishing? I don't think that's what the end is, right? Like my telos for evangelism, my understanding of where we're going in salvation is not avoiding suffering eternally. It's let's avoid suffering now. Let's recognize that as you said, the kingdom of God is at hand. Like the work is now. The pursuit of freedom, of shalom, of peace is now. I don't need to wait until people are dead for them to be human. And so if something causes people to suffer now, then that to me is not in alignment with the view of salvation. But for a lot of people in the world, a lot of Christians in the world, that is necessary for their understanding of salvation. And so for the academic study, I want us to keep it open. I want us to ask, like, how are Christians around the world understanding the practice of salvation? That's what I study. Then as a pastor and as a practitioner and as an evangelist myself, I have a particular way that I do that. But more broadly, that's the question I'm asking. How are Christians and Christian communities understanding the practice of salvation?
And again, to me, this is like I go to Matthew 25, where Jesus is talking about and he's separating the sheep and the goats. And he's like, when did I, when I was in prison, you came to visit me. When I was sick, you, helped me feel better. When I was naked, you gave me clothes. When I was hungry, you fed me. And, the person's like, oh, Lord, when did I do these things? Whatever you do to at least these you've done to me. And like, this is moving towards the end. This is the way he's talking about how I am understanding what it means to practice living this faith. If that is salvation, like if you are naked and somebody's giving you clothes, that is your salvation. If you hungry and somebody feeding you, that is your salvation. If you in prison and people are breaking down the barriers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Giving you liberation from incarceration, that is your salvation. Like it is there. It is in the text. And I think this focus on the avoiding hell, I would argue, emerges as a way to, and this is Blair, why I want to take it back to your work um, to allow people to enable systems of suffering to persist such that you can continue to benefit, like a small class of people can benefit from them at the expense
Mm-hmm.
of the larger whole. Like, this is why, again, going to Howard Thurman and his book Jesus and the Disinherited, why Thurman's like, my grandmother who was a slave. So Thurman's born in 1899. His grandma was born a slave and experienced emancipation. She was like, didn't want to have him read anything from what we would not know to be pseudo Paul, not stuff that Paul actually wrote, but the things that the enslavers would preach from to talk about slaves obey your masters, like all that stuff that's in that part of the New Testament, that's in Ephesians, right? She's like, no, don't do that, because that's what he would use to preach to us to make us feel like we should be enslaved. But she
Mm-hmm.
knew in her bones, she's like, that's not God.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, that's not God. Like, you could say this over and over again, but she's like, that's not the divine, right? And so that's what I mean. Like, when I'm talking about salvation, like, I think those of us who, which are all of us, are oppressed and marginalized and open to that flow of love, know what salvation begins to look like. As Blair, you said, like saying, what do you need to be healed? And I think with respect to your work, Blair, what I think is interesting, and the question I have for you is, one of the claims you make that I thought was so powerful, especially given the fact that the church is predominantly, the majority of people who participate in church and do church life are women. You have this sentence in here. You said, furthermore, a feminist analysis of evangelism is necessary because, based on Ruther's litmus test, evangelism cannot be considered a redemptive Christian praxis unless it leads to the flourishing and the full humanity of women. And I just thought, like, I think that gets to, again, salvation, right? What does that look like? But
Mm-hmm.
also, the fact of the matter is, if you could say a little bit more about how it hasn't led to the
Mm-hmm.
flourishing of women and what that looks like for you. Because clearly, I'm like, wow, when I read it, I mean, I highlighted it, I was like, that's insane to think about the fact that evangelism hasn't led to that flourishing. And
Mm-hmm.
given the fact that the majority of people in church are women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It raises the point too that, again, another way that we have commonly talked about evangelism is Christians talking to non-Christians to try to convert them into Christianity. That's not a full understanding of evangelism, because the church is not always saved, right? The church
Mm,
is not always a
mm,
place of flourishing. We have talked on this podcast plenty about patriarchy and misogyny within even our progressive Christian spaces, where women are the majority, but the women are not in control, or not offered control, or not fully autonomous within their own practice of Christianity. And so the Catholic Church actually has a really great framework for this. It's a papal document called Evangelium Nundi, and it talks about evangelism ad extra and ad intra. And so ad extra means towards the outside. Ad intra means towards the inside. So the work of evangelism is not just about the church speaking to the world. The work of evangelism, which is the pursuit of salvation or the practice of salvation, is also work we do inside the church. And so for me, a feminist evangelism is not just about proclaiming a liberative Christianity to the world that does not know the story of Christ in a liberative framework, or correcting the misinformation about Jesus that's out there, which is a whole other podcast. Or I think a lot of what actually the purpose of this podcast is like trying to voice a progressive Christianity. But also the work of evangelism is people who are experiencing suffering and oppression inside the church speaking back into the church and saying, we are not yet there. We have not yet arrived at shalom. I am suffering. You are causing me harm. And part of Christian community is encouraging people, empowering people to do evangelism, to speak of salvation with their fellow Christians. And so that's right, evangelism ad intra. So the pursuit of salvation is not from the church to the world. The pursuit of salvation is ongoing all the time in every space where there is brokenness, and that includes the church.
It makes me think about how, like, you know how before you can, we don't need to be worried about these other people until we could get it together at the house. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to convert people, bring people over when the house is a mess. It's just like, we can barely
Well,
get it
and this
together
is
ourselves.
right. There is a framework of evangelism that a lot of progressive spaces embrace, which was if the church is just the church, we don't need to say anything to the outside. And that, to me, as a feminist, doesn't go far enough because the church is hurting itself, right? So if the church is
Right.
just the church, then suffering keeps going. Like evangelism is not actually happening if we just leave the church to be the church. And so for me, that's a move from pacifist evangelism, which is what we've embraced in a lot of progressive spaces, which is we're just going to be in our communities, we're going to love each other. And if people happen to wander in, that's okay. For me, we need to have an activist evangelism because evangelism is not just from the inside to the outside. Evangelism is for everybody. And we need to be actively engaged in the ongoing pursuit of what we call holiness in the Wesleyan tradition, right? That shalom, that wholeness, that freedom from oppression, that engagement with autonomy, all of those things. And so pacifist perspective of evangelism just doesn't go far enough.
And so I think as a way to kind of move towards wrapping our conversation up, I would love, Blair, for you to detail a little bit more about that. I mean, it's like perfect transition as to like what an activist vision like looks like for you from a progressive space, because what Julia described to an extent is what I did at the loft. Like the first year I was there, I was intentional in not trying to grow. I was like, we have to do some healing. We got to figure out a little bit about who we are, and I have to do some preparation. Like we need to make sure we're on the same page, because I'm a
Mm-hmm.
Black pastor coming into a church that's not predominantly Black. And Julia is my worship director, Black, and and as she will tell you, the music, like things have shifted in my time there, right? Like it has shifted because of
Because of leadership.
well, the leadership shifted, but also like I think that I was trying to resonate with what I think the community, my experience of the community needs. But after a year, it has continued to grow, and we are, I guess, counter many of the trends that one might find that says churches are shrinking. That's not our issue. We're doing quite well in that regards. But also, I think more than that, um, it's much more organic. And Blair, what I hear, and by that I mean I'm not doing a lot of outreach. I'm not, it's more in reach kind of things. And so Blair, that's what, for me, again, I go back to what excited me about reading your work is I don't know what to do. Like I'm very comfortable saying like I'm like I don't know what to do. Like it sounds great. I'm like I would love to try to um I don't even know the right word. It's not even persuade or recruit, but like to tell people, hey, I think you should come to this space because we have this new thing that's going on that's amazing. And maybe that's some healing work I got to do. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe it's me, but like that's where I'm really curious because I have a more passive, or at minimum, I'll go back to nonviolent. Like I'm like, hey, once you're here, I'm going to do some stuff, but I'm not like, out there activist in the streets, if you will. So what does it look like for you? What is it like? What would you tell me to do? All right, as
Yeah.
your as a pastor, what would you tell me I need to be doing?
Well, then I think some of that comes from the moral injury of knowing that for so
100%.
many people in so many places, participation in church, even well-meaning church, has been harmful, has hurt them. And so there has to be an internal you're right, it is an internal process, um, where we understand that we begin with the end. We know what the hope is, but we also understand that humanity is in process. We are not arrived. No one is arrived, quote unquote, at Shalom. We have moments, we have glimmers, we have the inbreaking of the kingdom of heaven, but we are all always in process. And that is part of how people overcome moral injury. So moral injury, I use that word, but moral injury is essentially like when one witnesses atrocity or injustice and knows the right thing to do, but is institutionally or culturally bound from doing what they know the right thing to be, right? So we know the right thing to do is to love people and to be in community. And we know that being Christians helps do that. But institutionally, we don't know that every church is a safe place to invite other people to come in to do that. and that harm may persist. So part of healing from that is learning to manage the ambiguity of I can invite someone into a space that has been healing for me and love and support them and know that things might go wrong. But the risk is worth it because what could go right is so much more beautiful, right? It's like hospitals are the number one place of infection. Like you are more likely to get sick going to a hospital. But if you are suffering, is it better to go to the hospital and hope to find some healing and know that the risk may be that you might be infected with something else? Like that's the ambiguity we have to hold as progressive Christians, to know that as we pursue our own faith, we're doing so imperfectly, and the spaces we're in are going to do so imperfectly. But this is where I think there is a both and of the kingdom of heaven is at hand, but also there is a perfect kingdom, and we're using kingdom language, but like there is a perfect, beautiful space
Community.
of total healing, right? Like there is an eschaton, there is an end where God's love is made full. And I can hold on to that as the promise while I'm trying to get it right in the here and now. And that actually is what Advent is all about, right? It's recognizing that, like, because Christ has come into humanity, we have access to this total shalom, this total healing. And also it's not done yet. And so that for me is something that feminists have also helped me, especially Black feminists, especially womanists, right? Like that the suffering isn't going to go away completely, but that doesn't mean it's not worth trying to get there. And also theology from slave narratives of like the fact that the Black church during transatlantic slave trade could hold on to a hope of a future where they were healed and reconciled, and to do that even while they were getting slave master theology thrown at them. Like, to me, that is evidence that the hope of Christianity really is worth holding on to, even when it's not perfect where we are now. And so I hold on to those two things, those spaces of both and that's where we have to get to in order to do evangelism well.
No, I think
both inside and outside the church.
I think that's such a great point. You know, it's so funny you mentioned about the ways in which Slave Religion, which is a book by Albert Rabbitoe, and these other, James Cone wrote about these early converts. Some of them were Christian, many of them converted to Christianity, but how they were able to take this faith that they were exposed to and understand at its core where they found God, right? And what does that mean for them, and how could they find God in these narratives that allowed them to achieve salvation. And what was so fascinating for me is I remember just recently getting into this argument on TikTok with someone, like on I think it might have been on our podcast page actually, where someone was arguing with me about, basically like, how I don't know why Black people are still Christian if this is what the religion they use to enslave them. And it was frustrating to me because I'm like, this is a white person clearly, and I'm just like, I don't know why you would like not understand how that is undermining the intelligence of Black people by your argument. And also not knowing history, not knowing that there were Christians in Africa before slavery.
The first churches were
Black
literally in
people.
Africa. I can't.
Ethiopian.
I can't. The
Augustine, Saint Augustine, like I'm just like, these people are
book.
Black. These are Black people. But the funny thing is, so TikTok, you only can have like, I don't know how many characters. And so I'm like, I don't even know. I get into these things where I'm like, all right, I'm like, you gonna learn today. That's my brain. And so I start going in. I'm just like, this is what's going on. But what I realized quickly, I was like, this person, even though I'm an expert, they don't want to learn. Even though I'm like, let me tell you how you're wrong and help you understand it in a way that I would argue is pretty gentle, knowing me.
Let me tell you how you're wrong.
Yeah.
How gentle.
It's a
But
gentle way
actually,
for
that's
me.
the moment for evangelism, because that person is suffering They are
exactly.
hurting from their perception of Christianity, from their experience of Christianity, and you can offer them another perspective
Right.
that they get to choose whether or not they want to listen to.
Yep.
Right? So if you stitch that video and you say, "Hey, I want to offer you another perspective, just in case anyone else is listening to this and wants to try to maintain their Christian faith, here's how I've done it." Like, that is a moment that's offering you the opportunity to speak into someone's pursuit of salvation with your own story, and it's not impositional, and that person gets to choose whether they listen to you or not. But it's those moments that we have been so hesitant to step into as progressive Christians, and that's exactly where we need to step into.
And what I should have did was what you just said, stitch it, as opposed to getting in,
Right.
this, because I'm a person of words, and I'll be like, well, maybe I can use these words. I'm like, it doesn't work, man. This person clearly has, as you said, their own trauma responses, like,
Yeah.
such that they couldn't read what I was saying. They already had their idea made up, but other people perhaps would have been more open to it.
But you still
And
can stitch it, can't you?
I could, and maybe I will. I don't know. But Julia, to your point, you just said, like, for me to say, let me tell you how you're wrong, and I'm gonna do it in the nicest way. That is for me. I'm be honest with you. Like, this is the way I think. And when you get the downside of getting a degree, a PhD in ethics and theology, is
You know
I'll
too
sit.
much.
I know how to argue, and
See,
I
but
can.
it's instead the posture of like, let me offer you some additional information, which I know you know how to do as a teacher, right? That is so
Exactly.
much of what teaching is it's
But that is
let
not
me
what the
offer
internet
you
is.
an additional piece of information. And you're right, like the comment section is not the place necessarily for conversion,
It's not.
but
It's not. Yeah. No, this is how
but
I've
it
learned.
doesn't
Yeah.
mean it's not, it doesn't mean there isn't the possibility for those interactions, that those seed moments of you plant something with additional information with your own perspective, and then the beauty is you let it go, and God's either going to take it and run with it, or that person's going to reject it, and that's on them.
You
Yeah.
should find that comment. You should stitch it. You should snapshot it. I don't know. I'm not on TikTok.
I
I
know
don't
you're
know.
not. I'm
I'm
like, what are you
sure
talking
there's a
about? I'm like, see, you the young, you're like not even on TikTok. Well, you're not the youngest. I think Blair's younger than you, but
I'm
well, tech.
definitely not the youngest.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm the second
So
oldest, in
yeah.
fact. You're
Well,
the oldest,
hey,
Chris.
I am the oldest. I sound like I'm the oldest. I look like I'm the oldest. I feel like I'm the oldest. Like it is.
Our
It's,
wise leader.
yeah, there's something like that. Something like that. So thank you all. This has been an amazing conversation, and I'm curious for those of you who are listening, if this is the, we are trying to figure out exactly how to use Blair and I and Julian Wesley's honestly expertise, and have specific episodes that do a deep dive into some of the things that we know. Again, this is like a progressive theology of evangelism. We want to talk about a vision of race, what not only that, what church looks like. Honestly, we talked about salvation today, which I thought would be a separate episode, but I think we did a pretty good job of that.
Oh, there's so much more.
Yeah,
We could
there
unpack
is.
so many more things about salvation.
So we want to have some episodes like this, along with episodes dealing with what's happening in contemporary society, particularly politics. I mean, that is our wheelhouse, and I think that's something we need to be paying attention to. Just even though we know it's going to be difficult for the next little while. Stacey Abrams said, I was listening to her podcast, and she's like, one of the ways that we can allow them to win is if we just recede into our own depression about what happened. She's like, this is a time for us to be committed to being active, because that is how we know we can win. That is what it
Yes.
requires. And it was really, I mean, I don't know what her religious background is, or if she come from preachers, but like sometimes she'd be preaching, and I was just like, that was a word I needed to hear,
We
because I
can't
do believe.
seed the vision of what could be.
Yeah, we can't. And so we're going to continue to talk about politics, and all the things that, what makes this podcast, I think what makes us and do what we do, sprinkling in some musical theater and whatever other things,
Whatever.
the other things that Julia and
Art is
Wesley,
education. Art is education.
art is education. I mean, I've learned again, and to me, one thing we didn't talk about today, which we need to talk about at some point, and I said this in all seriousness, like, one of the things we reach people at the Loft is through music. It is through the ministry of what you do, Julia. Like, that is ministry. That is a part of what I know I want to invest in. And Blair was so funny, or maybe it was you. I can't remember what you said. And I'll say this, and I'll right? Like you're talking about what it means to like be in a space where people prioritize and center the voices and experiences of women. And and Julia will tell you, like my whole working relationship is like, just what do you need? Just tell me what you need, because I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm not trying. Just tell me what you need. We'll just go ahead and do that, and that's gonna be fine. And so that has made my life easier. Hopefully, that I think that has made your life easier,
Well, I
Julia, as far
thank
as I
you
can
for
tell.
trusting me and my vision, because my band is in a very good place right now and we're doing really good work. But the reason that is like you've kind of just like let me be guided by what I consider to be spirit, and like choose the music that speaks to me, and like hire the people that I think understand what I'm trying to do and like what we're trying to do. So that's you and your leadership. I salute you, good sir.
Well, it is, and I think Blair, gets back to your point about empowering people and creating spaces where people can. What do you need to be free? What do you need to give you your flourishing life? What speaks to you? And like, I would have never thought that having musical theater May, where we sing all these songs, would be such a powerful way to speak to people. And it
Yep.
is, right? And so like that's what in the unique community that we need in West LA. And that's something that Julia thought of. And I'm like, okay, let's do it. And then it turns out to be amazing. And so this is where I think reclaiming the concept, I would have not thought about that as evangelism had I not read your dissertation prospectus and us had this conversation. So thank you for the work you're doing, Blair and Julia, and all the amazing work that the two important women in my life are doing. So I want to thank you all for listening, for joining us on the Progressive Christian Podcast. If you would like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at the Progressive Christians. I will try not to argue with you if you say something that I don't agree with. I will do my best because I manage the social media. And again, I want to encourage you, if you like the show, please rate, review, share, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you're using. Please give us a 5-star review so we can get our listenership up and let people be exposed to a progressive, consider it an evangelistic tool, an evangelistic action by giving us this review such that we can reach more people. Thanks again, and we will see you all next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.